My first job off the family farm was as a radio DJ. I was just 17 years old. I was nervous, my voice was squeaky, and to this day, I cannot listen to those old air tapes. So if you ever find one, do me a huge favor and just set it on fire. Now, the man who owned that station became one of the great mentors of my life. He later became a dear friend. He had this crisp, nearly perfect, articulate diction, the kind of voice that you trust before you even hear the words. And almost every Sunday morning, that's when I was allowed to be on the air, when nobody's listening, about 15 seconds after the first newscast wrapped, the studio phone would ring. So the clock on the wall said 6:05 and 15 seconds because everything in radio is to the second. And I knew who it was before I picked up. He would say, "Dale, you need to slow down, enunciate, pronounce, and articulate every word clearly. You're going too fast." Then we would have a conversation about my choice of news stories and how they filled in, and that was the call. Those 6:05 a.m. phone calls live with me to this day. For a long time, I thought he was talking about my mouth. Turns out he was talking about something underneath it, and we're going to get there. I'm Dale Dixon, and this is the Presence Lab. Here's what I want to do with you today. I want to figure out why smart, capable leaders start talking too fast the moment the pressure goes up. I want to show you what's actually happening in our bodies when it happens, without turning it into just some science lecture. And I want to hand you 3 tools that you can start using this week, not someday, this week. So I've built a companion guide for this episode inside the Presence Lab on Sphere. It's called the Pace Control Field Guide. It's practical, it's not theoretical, because if you recognize yourself in this conversation and then never test anything, nothing's going to change. So we'll come back to it. You're going to find that field guide in the description of this podcast on whatever podcast player you're listening. So let's start with a distinction, because if I skip it, the whole thing just turns into cheap advice. I like to imagine that we're just sitting over coffee. So talking fast is not automatically bad. Some research going back decades found that moderately faster speakers can come across as more credible, more competent, and more persuasive. That makes intuitive sense. Fluency sounds like confidence. A person who moves quickly through clear material sounds like they know the material. So I'm not asking you to speak like you've been chemically tranquilized. Please don't do that. The world suffered enough boardroom monotone. The problem is not speed. The problem is speed that shows up because you're trying to escape discomfort. And there's a big difference between fluent and frantic. There's a difference between momentum and a man trying to get out of the room before the room catches him. See, back to my radio example, as that 17-year-old kid, I was trying to escape. I was nervous. I thought the faster I can get through this, the faster I can get to the music, the faster I can get to the commercial break where people don't have to hear me. It was that was what was happening in the subconscious. Oh, I wish I would have known that then. And here's the part most communication advice misses. People don't just hear our words, they hear our state. They can feel, even if they can't explain it, they can feel whether our pace is serving them or protecting me. When it's protecting me, it stops being authority. It becomes panic with a microphone. So let me make this concrete because you've lived it. Maybe even this week. It shows up when you're explaining something complicated and you feel the listener starting to drift. The honest move would be to slow down and make it simpler. What most of us do instead is speed up and add more information. It feels responsible and it feels like we're helping. But think about what's actually happening on the other side. Our listener is already carrying a load. They're tracking our point, our context, the implication, whether they agree, and whether this affects their budget or their weekend. That's a full stack. And when we speed up and add more, we don't lighten that load. We hand them another box and say, here, carry this too. So in Sweating Bullets, I called this the What's in It for Me, or WIIFM problem. It's the radio station that we're all tuned into. Fast talking answers a question they didn't ask while ignoring the one they did. It shows up when somebody challenges you. I'm not sure I buy that. Oh, a perfectly normal sentence, but our body might hear, you're about to lose status. So we answer before we've even understood the concern. We start defending a point that may not even be under attack. And that's the moment fast talking starts to sound defensive instead of confident. It shows up in interviews, it shows up in a podcast, a media hit, a sales call, a job interview. We get a question we wanted. We know the answer cold. And because the moment matters, we try to deliver everything we know in one breath. The result is not authority in that case. It's just a data spill. And once the words spill, the listener has to do the cleanup. That is a lot for us to ask. So never make the audience do cleanup. Somebody should stitch that on a pillow. Maybe not a nice pillow, just a functional one. And there's the one that surprises people. It shows up when we're over-prepared. So let me tell you about Mac Thompson. In Sweating Bullets, Mac is a chief operating officer who knew his material better than anyone in the building. His problem was never intelligence. It was never expertise. He had plenty of both. But under pressure, his body got there first. His throat would tighten. His breathing went shallow right off the top of his lungs. His hands found the lectern and then held on for dear life. And his rehearsed answer came out as a recording instead of just a conversation. He didn't sound ready. He sounded loaded, like someone just pressed play and walked away. And that's what the Bosu Ball chapter in the book is really about. Pressure doesn't expose what you memorized. It exposes what you actually know from a settled body. Mac had the content, he didn't have the state. So let's talk about the body, and let's do it carefully because there's a lot of sloppy brain talk out there. People love to say things like your amygdala hijacked you, as if there's a tiny almond-shaped villain in your skull pulling levers. And that's cartoon neuroscience. It's fine for a bumper sticker. It's not good enough for the work that we are doing here. So here's a cleaner version for you to think about. When you feel socially evaluated, when you feel challenged, watched, exposed, or at risk of looking incompetent, your body can read that as a threat. Now, it's not a bear in the parking lot. It's a status threat. And humans have always cared enormously about status, about belonging, and competence. So our stress systems can switch on. The heart rate climbs, the breathing gets faster and higher in our lungs. The muscles tighten up and our attention narrows. Our bodies shift into readiness. This is the flight, fight, or freeze mode. And none of that is a malfunction. That is our system doing its job. It's preparing for us to respond. The trouble is the kind of response high-stakes communication actually requires. We need working memory. We need to listen. We need to choose language deliberately. We need timing. We need judgment and the ability to pause and pick the next sentence on purpose. Those are executive functions, and they lean on prefrontal systems that are sensitive to stress. So a little activation sharpens all of that. We feel alert and engaged. Too much, and it starts to degrade. Our thinking gets less flexible, our working memory gets crowded, and we reach for the most familiar pattern available. For a lot of us, the familiar pattern is talk. Talk faster, explain more, fill the silence, don't let the quiet expose us. That's so important. Let that sink in. Don't let the quiet expose us. That's why fast talking is so often a regulation attempt. Our body is uncomfortable, and speech becomes the escape hatch. So picture a car sliding on ice. The inexperienced driver panics and hits the gas. That's what fast talking usually is. You feel the skid, so you accelerate. But control almost never comes from the opposite move. We ease off, we steer, we let the tires find the road again. For a leader, the road is breath, pause, and a finished sentence. And there's one more turn of the screw on this. Talking fast changes our breathing. Speech rides on the air we exhale. When we talk in long, fast streams, we burn through that air. The next breath comes higher and shallower, and then we get into this repetitive cycle. The voice tightens, the body reads that tight voice as more effort and more urgency, and then it just goes around. So the pressure speeds the speech. Fast speech wrecks the breathing. Wrecked breathing tells the body something's wrong. And so we speed up again. It's a doom loop, and it's the thing that we're going to break, not with fake calm, but with control. So let's get practical. 3 tools that we can run all 3 this week. Tool number 1 is the period drill. This is the simplest one and probably the most annoying, which is exactly why it works. So for 1 week, practice speaking in complete sentences with a hard stop at the end. Not a paragraph, not a wandering thought that turns into 3 thoughts wearing 1 trench coat. And I'll tell you, this is one of those areas that I find myself having to repeatedly work on, because I love to string sentences together with the word and so. I go back and listen to myself, and I do this all the time. Forcing myself to focus on the period at the end of a sentence helps to stop that. 1 sentence, stop, breathe, and then it's the next sentence. So here's what it sounds like. We need to slow the rollout. The customer feedback isn't strong enough yet. If we move now, we may create churn we could have avoided. That's it. You're training your mouth to stop when the thought is done. Fast talkers usually don't end sentences. They tape them together with and, so, but, kind of, just, and whatever other verbal duct tape is within reach. The period drill teaches us to finish, and authority, more often than not, sounds like finishing, not rushing to the next thought, not apologizing for the one we just had, just finishing. Run it in low-stakes places first. So I do this at dinner. I do it on a phone call, in a team huddle. I pick 1 conversation a day where my only job is to land the plane at the end of each sentence. Not every sentence has to be profound. Most are not going to be. Welcome to being human. But every sentence needs an ending. Tool number 2, the exhale before the answer. This one is for the hard questions. Most of us inhale sharply right before we answer. The body is loading up to speak, so it grabs air. The problem is that a sharp inhale can tip into a startle. It pulls the breath high into the chest, and it tightens the voice. Then we launch the answer before we've decided what it actually is. So try the opposite. When the question lands, let it fully finish. Then exhale slowly. Get that breath, and we're thinking about it in this moment. So I'm not going to let that breath just hit the top of my chest. I'm going to feel my stomach move when I take that breath to give me the air to go past my vocal cords and answer the question. So it's not and it's also really important, not a giant theatrical breath. The other person does not need to know this because we're not running a yoga class in the boardroom. Just a quiet exhale. We're sending our own system a signal. We're not sprinting, and we're buying ourselves a second to think about this. Here's the leadership point most people get backwards. A short pause before we answer usually makes us sound more confident, not less. Insecure leaders rush to prove they have an answer. Secure leaders take the beat to give the right one. Now, if the silence feels too long, build a small bridge. That's a fair question. There are two pieces to this, or let me separate the concern from the decision. The concern is valid, the decision still holds. That little structure does two jobs at once. It slows your pace and it tells the room you're thinking, not just reacting. And that is a big one. I want to respond. I don't want to react in any situation, especially a high stakes situation. Tool number 3 is the 70% rule. And this is for the smart ones, the over-preparers, probably you. Before a high-stakes moment, most leaders prepare 140% of what they could possibly say. Then they walk in and try to deliver 120% of it. And that's how good meetings go to die. So the rule is simple. Plan less than you know. Deliver only what the audience needs. If you've got 10 points, you really have 3. If you've got 3, you've got 1 that matters most. This is the message map from Sweating Bullets, and it's the spine of everything I teach. 1 headline, 3 supports, and the evidence underneath. That is enough. The point was never to empty the warehouse. The point is to hand the listener the one box that they actually came for. So here's the practice. Before your next meeting, answer 1 question on paper. What is the 1 sentence I need them to remember? 1 sentence. And then write 3 supports, not 9, just 3. And when you speak, stay inside that frame. If they want more, they're going to ask. And when they ask, now you get to answer, which is a far stronger position than burying them under everything you know and hoping that they just admire the pile. The 70% rule slows you down because it kills the false urgency to prove your expertise. You don't need to prove you know everything. You need to prove you can guide the room, and those are not the same things. Let's bring it home. Talking fast is not the enemy. Uncontrolled pace is the enemy. A fast sentence can carry momentum. A fast explanation can carry clarity. But the second speed becomes a stress behavior, our credibility starts to leak, and it leaks before anyone can explain why. Nobody in our meeting is going to think, his sympathetic activation appears to be elevating his speech rate and degrading his perceived executive control. That sounds so dumb. Normal humans don't talk like that, and we should all be grateful. What they're actually thinking quieter is, he seems nervous. I'm working too hard to follow this. I don't know why, but I don't fully trust it yet. That's the subconscious that's going on in our audience's minds. That's the danger. Trust is usually lost at the level of felt sense long before it's lost at the level of logic. So this week, don't try to become a slow speaker. Try to become a controlled speaker. Run the period drill. Exhale before the answer. Apply the 70% rule. And just watch what changes. You may notice people interrupt you less. You may notice your own thinking gets cleaner. And you might notice your words start to carry more weight because you stopped throwing them by the handful. So I told you that we'd come back to that phone call at the radio station. For years, I thought my mentor was correcting my mouth. Enunciate, articulate, slow down. I thought it was a diction note, a radio note. And I was wrong. He was teaching me state before either of us had the word for it. A 17-year-old kid, heart racing, sprinting through a newscast because his body was trying to outrun the fear of being bad on the air. The slowing down was never about the words. It was about the nervous system underneath the words. And here's what I understand now, that I didn't at 6:05 a.m. on those Sundays. The gift wasn't the instruction. The gift was that somebody was on the other end of the line. Somebody who had listened and then cared enough to call and told me the truth in 9 seconds and then let me get back to work. That's what the pace control guide is. It's that voice on the line for you inside the Presence Lab on Sphere. It's got the 1-page self-audit, the 3 drills, and a 7-day tracker so you can actually test this in real conversations instead of just nodding along and moving on with your life. So if this episode hit a nerve, that guide is your next step, because insight without practice is just entertainment with better lighting. That's not what we're building here. So run the drills, land the plane, and when that pressure comes, ease off the gas and steer. I'm Dale Diction. This is the Presence Lab. Slow down, hit a like button, drop a review, reach out and talk to me via email. I'll definitely see you next time.